Hi everyone, thank you all for your attention and for allowing me to share this virtual asynchronous space with you today. My name is Blaire Topash-Caldwell. Currently, I am the Public Humanities Fellow for the Darcy McNickle Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. But prior to that, my work was with my own tribe, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, which are located in southwestern Michigan of the US. And there I was a tribal archivist. But as I'll explain a little bit later, I wore many hats under that title. By the time that you see this, I will be in transition to a faculty position at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, so a number of different changes going on here. But I'm happy to have a few minutes to talk to you a little bit about future directions for archival and historical practice. Coming from my perspective of an Indigenous person who has worked with many different Native peoples in the US and in Canada. So this will definitely be marked by perhaps very particular circumstances in American organizations in the US and Canada, and may or may not be applicable to other areas of the world, but hopefully it's useful to you nonetheless. So my collaborative work with communities can feed into this conversation about how historical research and archival practice could be, and perhaps in some cases should be, pursued in the future. As the pandemic has showed us, of course, many organizations, both within this field and outside of it, have made huge strides in digital innovations, partly because we've had to. And I think we're at a certain point now where we're considering what would be best to further put our energies into the future, and what served our purposes well during a time of social distancing, but may or may not be useful into the future. So backtracking a little bit, my expertise, or my training rather, is in cultural anthropology. I did not go to school for library sciences, although I've worked for a number of different museums, mostly anthropology museums, and then also as consultant work on a number of different exhibits, from the Field Museum to small local historical societies. So a number of different curation projects, but then also, as I mentioned prior, I was archivist for my tribe in the Department of Language and Culture, more specifically the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And so there, as you might expect, a number of different projects or duties rather revolved around upgrading storage conditions, cataloging, and all that stuff. But then also launching digital platforms such as Mukuru, which is a content management system designed with the needs of Indigenous communities around the world in mind. And so I also ran a number of different programs, and this isn't meant to be a laundry list of different experiences or accolades, but just to kind of explain where I'm coming from in terms of what I have in mind for the future, and how some of these projects that are being pursued by a number of different tribes and people working with tribes can look. So the public programs were largely around community access to the collections, wanting to educate our tribal citizens about what is there, as well as encourage them to digitally donate a lot of historic photos, family photos, and things like that, as well as crowdsourcing within our community to identify a lot of the people in these photos. So this occurred by things like archives open house nights, having Mukuru available, training people on it, allowing them to contribute their own traditional knowledge in appropriate ways. So that's a little bit about me and the work that I've done. And more recently, as in my role of Public Humanities Fellow at the Newberry Library, which is a non-Indigenous institution, it has been largely as part of a grant-funded project pursued by my director, Rose Myron, who's the director of the Darcy McNickle Center, to make the Indigenous Studies collections at the Newberry Library more accessible to Native communities, help them find relevant information and materials, as well as recalibrate our own policies and workflows in order to more ethically manage and curate and store some of these materials. So what that looks like is really taking a fine-tooth comb to things like our culturally sensitive materials policy, looking at things or the feasibility of implementing traditional knowledge labels to certain items, calling out certain titles and descriptions within our collections as racist when they use racial slurs or offensive terminology. And certainly there's a lot of work to be done. We're only in a planning phase of what we're hoping will be a multi grant period project to sort of indigenize the library. And in order to do that, we are in constant dialogue with at least 3 different partner communities on the grant. And I don't have enough time to really explain how these came to fruition, but those 3 communities are the urban Indigenous Chicago community, which of course is a diversity of different tribal backgrounds. Another is Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico, and the other is Forest County Potawatomi, which is another band of Potawatomi from the tribe I'm enrolled in, and they're located in Wisconsin. So I would say when taking an eye to the current state of the field, whether that's museum studies or library sciences, looking at archives as a whole, if I had to sum it down, it would be to leverage the power of the institution to benefit Indigenous peoples. And what that looks like changes with what kind of collection material you have, what sort of communities are represented in your collection, etc. So these same organizations have greatly benefited from Indigenous peoples. And again, I'm coming from the background of American institutions. But as we know, anthropology and museum collecting went hand in hand with colonialism. We wouldn't have these materials unless it weren't for empire. So that means that we need to get away from well-meaning liberalism, which says that we serve all communities, or that we serve to benefit the public, the singular public, because and instead making a concerted effort to fund projects identified by Native peoples, and in some cases tribally led projects and priorities that may already be underway. Because these items, maybe they're cultural items, maybe they're information mined by salvage ethnographers back in the day, they still benefit the institution, even though the people working there, researching there today didn't actively go out and do those things, obviously. But there's tons of power and privilege and ability to apply for grants, and just having access to this information greatly disenfranchises and harms Native peoples while benefiting the institution. So trying to find ways to reverse that and getting away with, oh, we're just going to serve everyone and the public, and we're going to focus on access to these collections for everyone is not enough. It needs to be targeted, and it needs to be community led. And so that's all well and good, but what are the practical steps to get there? Now, I'm sure a lot of the other participants in this program have a lot of great ideas, but just to throw a few of those out there, one would be collecting and accessioning materials, not just about Indigenous peoples, but made by them. So if you're a museum, curating or commissioning new work by Native artists. If you're an archive, of course, books, or reaching out to photographers, purchasing their work, Native photographers. or even comic books, depending on the scope of your collections management policy. And then also, I think in terms of the state of the field and how it's changing, I'm glad to see that funding agencies and institutions as a whole are starting to respect the process of collaboration more, going beyond a buzzword to people realizing that that takes a long time to develop these meaningful relationships with communities, and it takes a lot of money. Well, it doesn't always take a lot of money, but that certainly helps, but it does take a lot of time and energy for sure. And that it's not going to be a one-off, that it needs to be iterative and occur over time in order to build trust and to really workshop future directions in partnership with these communities, Indigenous or otherwise. And some sort of things that I hope to see more of in the future too are making sure that consultants and people who are seen to have traditional knowledge, whether they're elders or young people, that they're getting paid for their work. The same way we would pay a PhD to consult on certain things. So they have specialized knowledge. They should be getting paid for that knowledge and for their time sharing it with you. And then finally, being open at least to expecting Native peoples and other communities to want to indigenize other aspects of your organization. This means that you might not be able to expect a very check the box sort of approach to consultation. Or just being able to hire Native consultants for an exhibit, for example. They might be very much interested in what else you have in your collections, if you have ancestors or human remains, and who you have sitting on certain boards, who has the power in those sort of circumstances, because chances are there might be some really problematic individuals that they might want to look at. And that's just a few sort of examples. So just being open to the fact that when you invite Indigenous peoples to consult on a certain project, that we see things very holistically, that even though we might have been approached for a very specific task, that it goes hand in hand with other aspects of your organizations, other diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives you may or may not have, and who might be on board of trustees or things like that. So thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to the question and answer portion of this event, where we can maybe talk about more specifics, or I can answer some questions that you have relevant to some of the topics I talked about just now. Thank you so much.